Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join this session on SOC Automation, Faster Decision Making and Response. My name is Skrei. I am the VP of Worldwide Sales Engineering for Exabeam, and I've been with Exabeam for just a little over 5 years. Prior to joining Exabeam, I was actually on the customer side. At that point, I was a lead security engineer at eBay, helping them rebuild their global SOC post-breach. And prior to my time at eBay, I was a manager at KPMG, helping some of the world's largest organizations increase their maturity and decrease risk. So I want to talk throughout this presentation about my experience with Exabeam from the customer side. And we're going to kind of start by talking about my kind of initial foothold into the eBay environment, which was actually during the breach itself and doing kind of the investigation of the breach alongside other folks. And then what I learned through that breach process into how I use that information to build a SOC. And then what I found is kind of shortcomings of what I was trying to build, and ultimately what brought me to the Exabeam technology itself. So let's start by talking about what did I learn in handling a breach. Well, I learned many things. I learned that it's actually, while it's a lot of work, it can also be a lot of fun. It's one of those things as a security practitioner, you do enjoy digging and finding those artifacts, and you want to find the attacker and get them out of the environment. But there are 3 things that I learned that I found really resonated with me when I saw this tweet and kind of brought them back to my memory. And this tweet is by Tyler Forness. He's a former Mandiant FireEye person, as well as now runs an MDR called Expel. And I want to really touch on these first 3 things because I think they're relevant for the rest of the conversation. Tyler says, what do you need to know about being a blue teamer? And this is also something I learned in my breach response is learning what's normal first is really important in security. Oftentimes, we spend a lot of time investigating things that are false positives, or we end up chasing ghosts, and these things turn out to be completely normal. And we need to do a better job of understanding what is our normal in our environment, and how do we give this understanding of normal to new people that come into our environment. When we just hire a new security analyst, I recently read a report that it can take up to a year before they're really comfortable or working at 100% capacity. They don't know the environment, they don't know normal. And it's really important to try and give them a solution that's going to give them an understanding of what is normal so they don't have to learn this themselves. Number 2, use prevalence to calibrate. And this also goes along with number 1, right? How do I understand what's important to investigate and look at? I need to kind of understand prevalence. And this is kind of twofold. It's either behavior or kind of artifacts, right? So from a behavior perspective, I want to know, do these types of people normally do this, right? Do non-domain admins normally create domain accounts? Or do I see this type of behavior for this particular type of user or within this part of my network? So that's important. Also understanding the prevalence of artifacts, whether it's files, hashes, IPs, and domains. What normally happens in my environment and how pervasive are these artifacts? Are they seen all over the place? Right. I had a situation when I was doing the eBay breach. The first day I got on site, someone gave me a workstation and said, hey, can you investigate the logs? Help us understand, is this part of the breach? Is this a compromised host? And these first 2 are really important, right? What is the prevalence of the activity and things I'm seeing on this device, and what is normal? And ultimately, I ended up investigating the logs and found a remote access tool on this device, and the process name included Chinese characters. And of course, I thought, aha, I found something, right? This is interesting. But it turned out that actually the prevalence of this particular tool was completely normal in the environment, right? It was all over the place on half of the workstations. So I spent time chasing a ghost. So these first 2 go hand in hand and are really important. And on the prevalence side, it's not just what's prevalent in your environment, but also externally, right? Where else have I seen this file or hash? Or where else am I seeing attacker behavior that mimics what I'm seeing potentially in my environment? How do I weed down and start to kind of better understand from an attribution perspective, what threat actor might this be? And then finally, number 3, timelines. Learn them and love them. That's what Tyler says. And this is not a concept that I understood until I went through a breach. I had helped build SOCs all around the world and hadn't really thought much about timelines until I went through the breach and we took a giant roll of paper in our war room and we're building a timeline manually of the attacker and the artifacts and where we saw him and what credentials this attacker was using. And I started to realize that timelines were much more important and not just something we should build when we have a major moment or a major breach. It's something we should try and bring into the day-to-day work of the SOC analysts themselves. And then finally, number 4, we're not going to touch on in this particular session, but report writing is hard, right? And it does take practice. And I think report writing is one of those things, it does become really important. And to be able to write reports that are technical enough that really, so anyone can understand what really happened, but also high level enough that you can bring to an exec or to the board, right? So kind of striking the balance is really important, especially during a breach. So after the breach, I had the ability to build a SOC from the ground up, people, process, and technology. And so there's many things that I learned in rebuilding a SOC. And first was, the SIEM that I bought 6.5 years ago, and still some of the legacy SIEMs today, they provide a lot of possibilities, but they're a platform to build on top of as a customer. They don't provide a lot of out-of-the-box detections that are valuable. And so, this is something that we ran into. I ended up having to hire a whole team just to build content and build those detections so that the next time that attacker came into the environment the same way, that we would be proactive and be able to find them right away. Number 2, after we built the detections, I needed someone to investigate. And so I had to hire my SOC analysts. And I found that I could find kind of 2 variations of SOC analysts. I could find the SOC analyst that was more of a SIEM ninja that knew how to write all the complex queries and get answers to any question anyone had. Or I could hire the SOC analyst that was more of that pure play security practitioner. They knew what are the right questions to ask when I get that phishing incident or I have this malware infection on a machine. And what I started to realize is that the quality of my investigations really lied at the heart of the questions that were being asked. And so I gravitated to hiring those security analysts that knew what are the right questions that I need to ask and answer as part of an investigation. And I could teach them the security tools and ultimately see how I could actually automate those questions and answers that they were trying to get. Credentials are at the heart of most major breaches, and this was no different in the case of eBay. We had credentials that were compromised, and so we knew we needed to collect the authentication logs, especially from our domain controllers. But again, we realized that this was really hard to understand what to do with these logs, how to normalize them. What is the difference between a 4624 and a 4768? This was a big challenge for my team, especially analysts that might not be that familiar with Windows. As we collected more logs, we started to realize that collecting more data didn't make us more secure. It actually made it harder to glean the insights that we really wanted to out of that log data. It's just more data to slog through, more normal to try and kind of get out of the way, if you will. And ultimately, what I saw is my SOC analysts were looking more like DBAs, right? They were just going through this process of query pivot, taking the question, writing a query, taking the output of that query, putting in another query, right? At the end of the day, they weren't really using their brains the way I wanted them to really do the analysis that was required. And so I saw because of this, I was having a hard time getting consistent response across analysts. So I went through a little experiment. I gave the same malware alert to 2 different analysts within my SOC, and I asked them, what's the response? What should we do? And they came back with 2 different outcomes because they looked at my SIEM at different log feeds over different time frames and did different levels of analysis and came back with inconsistent results. And this was a problem for me, right? I needed consistency in how we were handling and triaging the alerts. And so I was trying to figure out how do I get automation into my team? We had some automation with tools, to go block IPs on the firewall or sinkhole through our DNS. But what I needed is automation in the triage and investigation process. And so if we look at kind of the workflow of a SOC analyst, it's kind of broken down into these 4 buckets. You have your detection, your triage, your investigation, and your response. And so where I needed the automation really was in mainly the triage and investigation for consistency, but also it'd be great if I get it on the detection side because I'm spending a tremendous amount of resources trying to figure out what should I detect and how do I recreate real-world attacks from a blue team perspective. And so if we look at kind of the alert lifecycle of my SOC when I had no automation, it was just kind of building on top of my SIEM and my log repository, this is kind of the process we went through. So we wanted to build a detection, maybe something like VPN from risky geos. Well, first I need to kind of seed my detection with the normal, right? I need to understand, does anybody connect from China today and how often? And kind of build an approved list, knowing full well that it's going to require constant tuning along the way. So I built my detection, it fires. Now someone needs to triage it. They need to figure out, is this bad? Is it a problem? Is it a false positive that I can ignore? Can I send it back as tuning, or do I need to investigate? And so to try and figure out, is it bad or does it need an investigation, I need to know some basic information, like who is the impacted user, right? Are they an admin, an executive, anything special about their credentials? I want to know, has this user ever connected from China before? Maybe they didn't meet the criteria of my initial approved list, but this is a normal behavior for them. Then I want to know, where do they normally connect from, right? Globally, what is their true normal? How many times do they VPN in and from where? And then I may want to know, where have they connected from in the last week, right? Maybe they were in the US and then I saw them pop up in Singapore, Japan, and now China. Might make more sense than all of a sudden if I just see them pop up in China out of nowhere. So let's say I need to investigate. This does look bad. Well, now my team needs to figure out what happened before and after this particular connection. Why did this user connect from China? Right? What's driving this? Were there other indicators? Was the user infected with malware, phish? Do I see DLP alerts? What else is going on? And ultimately, I know this connection was successful, so I want to know, what did the user do when they connected from China? And was any of this normal? I need to understand the full scope. What was accessed? What happened? And then I can respond. And the basic response to something like a user popping up from a risky geo would be to kill that VPN connection, maybe reset the credentials, and possibly reimage that laptop. And so this was a very manual process in my SOC, and it was error-prone. Each one of these questions that we're trying to answer here was a query or multiple queries. And it depended on how far back my analyst went to find out, is this normal? Has this happened before? This is ultimately what I was trying to avoid, is getting this inconsistent response and missing a real attack or a real threat. So why did I buy Exabeam? Well, it was to solve these problems we just talked about. And so there were 3 differentiators that I found with Exabeam versus any other UEBA or SIEM technology at the time. And the first was that ability to automate the entire SOC workflow from detect all the way to respond. The ability to put a very tight lens or close lens on attacker and insider behavior. So when an attacker comes in and they're mimicking legitimate credentials, being able to identify that and how this deviates from a normal baseline. And then finally, that ability to augment existing security tools. I just bought a SIEM, and I just needed something that is going to give me more value out of that SIEM and provide more value on top of those expensive logs that I was collecting. So if we talk about automating the triage and investigation steps, again, 4 basic steps here. So detection, right? I had a whole team building detections, 3 or 4 people constantly thinking about what should we be detecting and how do we build this logic. Then my analyst team of L1s would take these detections and start to triage them, provide feedback onto what's working, what's not. If something did fire and it looked bad, my team of investigators, right, my L2s, would start to dig in and answer these questions on the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And then ultimately, we need to get this threat out of the organization and do a good response. Now, Ponemon Institute actually conducted a study on behalf of Exabeam and asked 900 organizations, where does your SOC team spend their time, right, across these 4 different areas? And what we came to find is that 74% of an analyst's time is in these first 3 phases, right? Detect, triage, and investigate. Now, as I travel all over the world and I talk to organizations about automation in the SOC, 9 times out of 10, the conversation turns into response automation, kind of that category of SOAR, security, orchestration, and automated response, to which Exabeam also has a product. But the challenge here is that we need to be bringing automation further upstream, where our team is spending most of their time. This is ultimately what I found that Exabeam did that no other technology was doing on the market, is automating this full life cycle, providing more detections out of the box, helping my analysts triage, investigate much faster, so I could do better response. And so how does this work? How does Exabeam give you the ability to triage or to automate triage and investigation? Well, it comes to this idea back to timelines, right? And the idea is that we should be building timelines for every single event or alert that comes into our SIEM, right? If I have a piece of malware, my analyst is writing queries, trying to get answers to where did it come from? What did it do? Did it dump credentials? Where did it go? And they're going to take all of these questions and they're going to try and build a timeline of what happened when this malware was in my environment. And so Exabeam can actually automate this process. I actually had one of my SEs go through the process of trying to figure out how many queries does it take to do a good malware investigation in a data lake of any kind. And he came back with 96 queries at 12.9 minutes per query, ultimately 20 hours, just to investigate one piece of malware for one user on one day. Now, if you extrapolate this across all of the threats that are happening in your environment, there's no way that humans or you can put bodies on this problem. You need to automate this process. And that's what Exabeam is able to do. And it's able to provide this picture of a timeline, right, that gives you all of this automation and is going to answer these questions before you even have to ask them. Like, what person or entity is involved in this attack? What other accounts or assets might be involved? What is abnormal and what is normal? What has happened before? And what happened before, during, and after? Right? So now this was this ability for my team to get consistent response. My analysts were looking at the same timelines with the same level of analysis, and I was getting more understanding of everything that happened. So I was getting complete response and ultimately a better understanding of everything that had happened so I could do better response at the end of the day. I can go do that remediation and make sure that I'm not just handling the individual asset where the threat occurred, but everything else that happened around it. And so if we look at the alert lifecycle now with automation, right? So instead of building a rule for a risky geo that's defined, I can say, just show me any VPN logins from any sort of abnormal geolocations, right? And have the engine learn what is normal and bubble up those things that are abnormal. When it comes to triage, is this bad? The alert fires that says first time from China. Well, it's already going to know who the user is because the context is brought into the detection, so I can see it's an executive. The question of have they ever connected from China before? Well, no. If the alert is first time from China, I know they've never done this before. And because we've modeled what is normal, we can clearly see from the data model that the user normally connects from the US, and that's where they connected from in the last week. So now I need to triage, or I've triaged this, it looks like a threat I need to investigate. So I want to know what happened before and after. Well, the analytics in the timeline can clearly show me that, before this happened, the user the day before got an email from a domain for the very first time that had never sent him an email. And also my EDR gave me an alert yesterday as well. And so I can clearly see that this user was phished, got malware. Now I need to know, well, what happened when this VPN connection occurred? Well, we can see through the timeline that the user actually accessed many new systems and applications for the very first time. And so from a response perspective, my response is more complete. I can now execute my phishing playbook to potentially stop other compromises across my environment. I want to run the malware playbook to clean up the machine so I don't have to re-image it potentially. And also terminate that VPN session and reset the password. But you can see here I'm doing more than just terminating that session, re-imaging that machine, and kind of handling this on a one-off basis. I can actually be more proactive and stop this threat from harming others in my environment. The second big thing was around gaining visibility into compromised credentials, right? So compromised credentials have been a problem really ever since security, right? And cybersecurity. If you look at this chart on the left from 2010 to 2014, the top threat vectors, number 1, credentials, number 2, RAM scraper, 3, keyloggers, and 4, phishing. Now, you could make the argument that those bottom 3 are also 9 times out of 10, those are catalysts to get credentials, right? Attackers are lazy. Credentials are easy to obtain and they're easy to hide behind. And this is what attackers gravitate toward. And so it's been hard historically to figure out, well, how do I detect compromised credentials? And so MITRE's been a really great framework for a lot of our customers to start to leverage because it's all about attacker behavior and it's all about credential use. And so when you look at kind of starting to use MITRE, I think it's important to understand where to start. Right? I think the first and foremost is the MITRE framework is all about attacker behavior. Therefore, we need some sort of behavior analytics capability in order to accurately detect these types of threats without a high degree of false positives. Right? If you look at how MITRE says you should detect suspicious account creation, they say perform regular audits and look for suspicious accounts being created by an adversary. Well, what does that mean? How often do I audit? Daily, weekly? And how is my analyst supposed to know what suspicious is? We need kind of that baseline. The second thing with MITRE is where do I start? Well, CrowdStrike actually does a report every year, and they actually built this MITRE heat map that you're seeing on screen. And what they do is they actually rank what are the most widely used TTPs in the breaches they respond to each year. And what it turns out is in every column where valid accounts is a TTP, it's the most widely used, right? And this again supports that claim that attackers want credentials, and it's easy for them to use, and so they hide behind them. And you'll see the numbers next to some of these threat vectors here, and those are actually the number of out-of-the-box rules from a detection perspective that Exabeam has for this particular TTP. So you see we have 199 different detections. This comes back to that earlier conversation about how do I automate detection better using data analytics. And then third and last, the reason I looked at buying Exabeam was that ability to augment my legacy security tools. And it really wasn't a legacy tool. I just made the investment in the SIEM. But what I started to realize is my SIEM needed a brain so I could allow my analysts to use theirs, right? I didn't want them having to do these repetitive queries, trying to answer the same questions for all of these attacks that were occurring. I was investing heavily in my SIEM, pumping a lot of log data into it. I just needed something that would bolt right on top. And I wanted quick time to value, and I saw quick time to value. Exabeam was actually able to catch our red team for the very first time post-breach without any sort of writing of rules or tuning the system. And it provided an improved visibility across all of our different environments. We were relying more on the ability to detect anomalies and not have to look at correlation and static rules alone. It was helping us prioritize our alerts by modeling the alerts themselves. All of the AV detections we had were now getting risk ranked based on, are they commodity? Are they seen in the environment all the time? Or is this an AV signature we've never seen? Something rare in the environment that we need to look at a little bit more seriously. And these machine-generated timelines, right? These saved my analysts a ton of query pivot, but gave me more consistent response as well. So they were instrumental in how we looked at how do my SOC analysts interact with logs and events in a much more streamlined fashion. And ultimately, because of all of these things and these timelines that connected the dots, I was able to respond using our automation and ultimately playbooks to the entire scope of the attack, and not just that initial foothold, or not just a piece of the pie, but the entire thing that was occurring within the environment. So this is really why automation is so key within the SOC. But we need to think about, where do we actually need to spend time automating? Let's not put all our eggs in automating at the very end. Let's start to think about how we can start to automate further upstream to better inform our response downstream and leveraging automation there. So with that, I'd love to thank you for taking the time to join this session. If you have any questions or want more information, please feel free to visit our virtual booth. Thank you.